Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. I like to think I can spot a bad person. I have pretty good instincts and friends often tell me things like, "Remember when you told me to be careful with that one? I wish I had listened." I'm old and I've been in bad relationships, I've been the victim of a con man, and I like to think I learned something from those experiences. I've had time to learn about people and I just think I'm pretty good at picking up on vibes. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter how good our instincts are or what we've experienced, we never know what's going on in someone else's head. We never really know what someone's intentions are or what their limits are or what they're capable of. And some people are monsters who are very, very good at hiding in plain sight. This is the case of serial killer Rodney Alcala, known as the dating game killer. Let's get into it. September 13th, 1978. It's a Wednesday in Los Angeles. It's an era of great change and prosperity in America. Grease and Saturday Night Fever and Close Encounters of the Third Kind are all the rage at the movie theater. We were watching Dallas and Fantasy Island on TV, and in just a few weeks, Jim Jones would change the world forever at Jonestown. But for Cheryl Bradshaw, a young drama teacher, this was a special Wednesday because she was going to be on TV. She had auditioned and been accepted as a participant on The Dating Game, which was a very cheesy, very dated TV show where a single person would sit behind a screen and ask potential suitors innuendo-laced questions. There were no background checks at the time, no mass tort lawsuits over daytime TV yet, no safety checks in place, just a TV show matching up strangers who were looking for a good time and perhaps a partner. So I found the footage of the dating game show with Rodney Alcala on it. I loaded it onto YouTube to test it and make sure it wasn't copyrighted. I built my entire episode around it. I finished my episode, I loaded it onto YouTube and set a date for it to go public, which is what I always do. And then last night before it was set to go public, I double checked everything and there was a copyright claim on it. This is the kind of crap that we have to deal with here on YouTube. It is just absolutely unbelievable. Even though I went through all of the steps to make sure I could use this footage and my video scheduled okay and I was not alerted to any issues, I came back weeks later and there was a copyright claim. So I just think the best policy in this situation is honesty and transparency. That's why this episode is shorter than most. I had about 5 minutes of this dating game footage I wanted to show you. I really would have liked to share it with you and I'm really sorry about this. Nothing I can do. All we can do is hope that at some point there is some consistency on this platform. Also, sorry, I have a really bad cold. Poor Cheryl Bradshaw had no way of knowing that the man she had just selected to go on a date with was a serial killer. We were just speaking about intuition, and luckily Cheryl listened to hers. After the show finished taping, she and Rodney Alcala went backstage where they chatted for a moment. Rodney told Cheryl he was going to take her on a date that she would never forget. Cheryl thought Rodney was handsome, but there was something very off about him, and she felt it. She later told a reporter, "I started to feel ill. He was acting really creepy. I turned down his offer because I didn't want to see him again." Cheryl did not go on her date, and that decision very likely saved her life. Had there been any type of background check system in place, the producers of The Dating Game would have discovered that this episode's Bachelor number 1 had already spent 3 years in prison for a crime I can't even bleep out here anymore apparently, and he had also beaten 2 of his victims, badly. His crimes were so heinous that they landed him on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, but that wasn't even the half of it. Rodney Alcala had already committed 4 murders that he hadn't even been linked to yet. August 23, 1943. Rodney James Alcala, born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Berguar, is born in San Antonio, Texas. When he was 8 years old, his father moved his family to Mexico, only to abandon them all there 3 years later. His mother saved up some money that she used to move the family back to Los Angeles.
When Rodney was 17, he enlisted in the Army, but he had basically a nervous breakdown. He was known as kind of a strange guy, but he became almost catatonic after enrolling in the military, and he was quickly discharged because of his mental state. Rodney was a very smart human being. He had an IQ of around 135, and that easily got him accepted into UCLA. Unfortunately, he wasn't much interested in college. He had very, very different interests that didn't involve anything academic. Rodney had very dark desires, and he was a vicious, violent man. I cannot tell you about his first 2 crimes at all because they were committed against minors. During the course of the first one, in which the victim, Tally Shapiro, survived, but barely, a passerby called the police. That passerby saw something that didn't sit right with them, a man and a little girl going into an apartment, and when the police arrived, Rodney fled the apartment and was a fugitive for years. They couldn't find him. That is how he ended up on the FBI Most Wanted list. At some point, someone recognized Rodney Alcala from an FBI wanted poster they saw his photo on, and he was arrested and taken back to Los Angeles and forced to stand trial for his crimes. The victim in this case was young and very traumatized, and her family did not want her to testify, which I fully understand, but that resulted in a weak case against Rodney, and so he was only charged with assault and at trial received just 3 years behind bars. He was later charged with a second crime committed around the same time as the first, but again didn't get a lot of time in jail. He was released the first time in 1974, then re-arrested for this second crime involving a girl who he gave a ride to. He only did 2 years for that, and again, he was set free. I will stay off my soapbox today about these repeat offenders that spend no time in jail and are then just released into the public, because you already know how I feel about that. But yeah, here we are again. We see this all the time. Rodney does his couple of years here and a few there, and then he's back out, free as a bird and looking for his next victim. July 1977. Rodney's parole officer, for some unknown reason, allows his charge, this known offender, a violent criminal, to get on a plane and fly to New York. So he moved clear across the country to New York City and began using the alias John Berger. He enrolled in film school at New York University, and it has been widely reported, erroneously, that he studied under Roman Polanski there. Roman Polanski never taught at film school. This is just one of those things that has kind of become urban legend, but it didn't happen. Can you imagine a scenario where Roman Polanski is the second worst person in a room? I mean, the guy made some great movies I love, but I have to not think about him when I watch them. Here's a terrifying fact. Rodney actually worked at a children's art camp when he was in New York. Just a vicious, horrible offender who had done terrible things. Working at a kids' camp, it's the stuff of nightmares. Not even a week after arriving in Manhattan on July 18, 1977, 23-year-old Ellen Jane Hover goes missing. We could really do an entire episode on this one story because it was a very big deal. Jane Hover was a socialite. She was the daughter of the owner of the hugely popular nightclub Ciro's, that club with the famous sign that you see in a lot of movies from the 1970s. Ellen's godfathers were Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. She was from a very well-off, very well-connected family. Somehow, she met up with Rodney Alcala, who, remember, was calling himself John Berger at the time. Rodney killed her and then placed her body under some rocks on a hillside overlooking the Hudson River. Ellen was not found for 11 months. As soon as she went missing, there was an intense search for Ellen. Her family was powerful, like I said, well-connected. She was on the front page of the New York Times, the Post. There were missing posters of her everywhere. It was a very big story. The only clue the police had to go on was Ellen Hover's calendar. On the day she disappeared, she had written John Berger. No one knew who John Berger was, or why Ellen would be meeting him, or where, but that's all they had. Rodney Alcala returned to Los Angeles, and he went to work as a typesetter for the Los Angeles Times. This was in 1978. And while working there, some cops came to his place of employment, and they said they needed to speak with him. These cops were investigators working on the task force working the Hillside Stranglers case. They wanted to talk to Rodney because he was a known offender, and they were trying to get insight into how the Hillside Stranglers thought. They believed by speaking with other offenders, they could get that insight. Can you believe that? Only in the 1970s could cops looking for one very famous unknown serial killer interview another unknown serial killer asking for his help, right? I mean, sometimes it feels like you could throw a rock and hit a serial killer in the 1970s. It was wild back then. I think the cops first went to Rodney to see if he might be the Hillside Strangler, but after he was able to prove alibis on some of the important dates, he was ruled out. They did find some pot on him when they talked to him, so he had to go to jail for a brief time for that. But soon, he was back on the streets. About 5 months after Rodney returned to LA, the police have connected the dots between John Berger of New York and Rodney Alcala of LA. I couldn't find a lot of information on exactly how that happened. The FBI brings Rodney Alcala in and questions him about Ellen Hover's murder. He said that yes, he knew Ellen and that they had spent a wonderful afternoon together in Westchester. They were taking photos together, but he denies knowing anything about her disappearance. Remember, she wasn't found for almost a year. They hadn't found her at this point. The cops don't have much to go on. They don't even have a body at this point. So unbeknownst to them, a serial killer slips from their grasp. Rodney then devised this scheme. He had seen in both Los Angeles and in New York fashion photographers working with young models, and as he watched them, he realized people will do almost anything for you if you tell them you're going to publish their photos somewhere that might make them famous. So Rodney buys a nice camera and he starts posing as a photographer. Now back then, photographers had a portfolio. I mean, they still do, but now it's more digital. Back then it was an actual book that they would take around with them. And it was common for photographers to approach people and butter them up, tell them they were attractive, and ask them to model for their portfolio. They didn't usually even have to pay people. People would do it simply because it was an ego trip to be told they're beautiful enough for a photographer to want them in their portfolio. One time, a coworker of Rodney's was going through his portfolio, and she saw very quickly on the second or third page that the girls were naked. When she asked Rodney about this, he said, "Their mothers told them to pose for me." This coworker was gobsmacked by that response. She later said, "Of all the excuses or reasons he could have given me, he came up with that?" He was a strange guy. He wasn't a person with a lot of friends, but he was just nice enough looking and just mediocre enough to pass as normal, I guess. I think now we're more savvy and he'd be thought of as a creeper, but it was the 1970s. There were a lot of creepers. One woman named Leanne Leadham, who posed for Alcala, did so even after seeing his portfolio, which included pages and pages of naked young males. Most of the photos were explicit, but Rodney explained the photos away by saying they were art, and some people just weren't sophisticated enough to understand it. I mean, I actually agree that some art that offends people is just kind of over their heads. I'm no rocket scientist, but sometimes people get their short hairs in a bunch over things that I find really silly, you know? But this, I mean, young people like that, I don't know how you explain that away as art. During this time, posing as a photographer, we know that Monique Hoyt, underage, was knocked unconscious and assaulted while she posed for Rodney, and I have no doubt she was only one of many. In fact, many of the people in Rodney's portfolio have never been identified, so we really have no idea how many people were victimized. The police have released Rodney's portfolio to the public in an attempt to assist them in identifying the victims. There are lots and lots and lots of photos, and most of them we don't even have any idea who the people are or if anything bad happened to them. Did they get out of their photo shoot alive, unscathed? We just don't know. Then in 1978, Rodney goes on the dating game. Isn't that terrifying? This guy just on TV, he's been in prison, he's been on the FBI most wanted list, but it's the 70s. You can't pull up a page on the non-existent internet and check somebody out, you know? We just talked about the zombie hunter, Brian Miller, who was just out there posing with cops. A known serial killer taking pictures with cops in his cosplay outfit. It's crazy. They live among us, my friends. They are right here in our midst. They are our neighbors, our coworkers, And that is why so many of us are fascinated with them. We live among monsters, and it's terrifying, and it's interesting, and it's really, really crazy when you stop and think about it. June 20th, 1979. Robin Samso, 12, disappeared somewhere between the beach and her ballet class in Huntington Beach. Robin's friends told the police that a man walked up to them on the beach and he had a camera. He said he was a photographer and that he wanted to take their photos. Well, the girls were savvy and they knew better and they walked away, but Rodney kept watching them, and when Robin was alone, he abducted her. I can't tell you really anything he did, but it was beyond savage. Robin's friends were able to help the police work up a sketch of the man that they had spoken with that day. This is what they came up with, and it's actually one of the better police sketches from that time. Some of the sketches back then were just unusable, but this one is pretty solid. Robin's decomposing body parts were found by a park ranger 12 days after she disappeared near the Pasadena foothills. Police began passing the sketch of Rodney Alcala around the area, and people recognized him. Several of them gave police this photographer's name, and when police looked into him, they saw his criminal record. Well, they were pretty sure they had him at that point. The sketch and Rodney's record were enough to get a warrant. Police searched Rodney's house, and then they got a warrant to search a storage unit registered to Rodney that was near his mother's house in Seattle. When they did, they found one of Robin Samso's earrings. They had him. Rodney was put on trial in 1980 for the murder of Robin Samso. The jury quickly found him guilty and he was given the death penalty, but then that verdict was overturned because higher courts felt it was prejudicial to allow the jury to hear about Rodney's criminal history. Now, thankfully, he wasn't released, but it took 6 years to put him back on trial. In 1986, he was again convicted, and again he was sentenced to death. This one didn't hold up either. Rodney's defense claimed that the park ranger that found Robin was unreliable, and that because the jury didn't hear about the fact that he'd been hypnotized by a police hypnotist, his testimony should have been thrown out. Now, I am not really sure what the hell happens for the next 2 decades, but finally in 2010, Rodney Alcala was tried a third time, and this one stuck. I remember seeing him back in the news around 2010 in that time and thinking, wait a minute, this is the guy from the 70s. Why is he back on trial now? And as I kind of started to look into it, I realized we would need hours to talk about all of the legal wrangling, all of the different cases, and why it took so long to bring charges. All the time, Rodney is sitting in prison, appealing his convictions. Investigations into his additional crimes continue. He also wrote a book called You, the Jury. In this book, he proclaims his innocence and claims that the new policies of collecting prisoners' DNA for databanks of DNA is unconstitutional. He also sues the California penal system, once for a slip and fall and once because the prison refused to provide him with a low-fat menu. I've got a slip and fall for you, Rodney. I mean, honestly. I'm surprised someone didn't take this guy out. I really am. Well, the reason Rodney was so opposed to the DNA collection policies is because he knew he was about to be linked with additional murders, and that's exactly what happened. Rodney then decided he was going to act as his own attorney from now on, which is just always a circus. You know that old saying, a person who acts as their own attorney has a fool for a client? Well, there's nothing truer than that. It's always a really dumb thing to do. While in court, acting as his own attorney, Rodney starts questioning himself, asking himself questions. And then when he answers the questions that he poses, he uses a different voice, like a deeper voice. So yeah, it's just a freak show. He claims he was at Knott's Berry Farm when Robin was killed. And then, as part of his closing argument, he plays an Arlo Guthrie song. He plays Alice's Restaurant Massacre. I'm actually surprised the judge allowed him to do that, but you do get a lot of leeway in closing arguments. So by the time we reach 2010, police have used Rodney Alcala's DNA to link him to additional crimes. And one of those crimes was the murder of 18-year-old Jill Barcombe, who was murdered and found in the Hollywood Hills in 1977. Rodney's DNA links him to Georgia Wickstead's murder as well. She was a 27-year-old nurse found dead in her Malibu apartment in that same year, 1977. Rodney is confirmed as 21-year-old Jill Parenteau's killer. She was found beaten and strangled in her Burbank apartment in 1979. And he's also linked to Charlotte Lamb, a 31-year-old woman who was found murdered in the laundry room of an El Segundo apartment complex, not even her own complex, in 1978. So you can see he was just kind of all over Southern California, killing people in their homes, in public. He was stalking them. He was waiting for his time. And he was getting away with it, but the DNA was conclusive and he wasn't going to get away with it any longer. The indictments began rolling in for these additional victims, even well before 2010. I think they connected Rodney to some of these victims back in 2004, and he was finally going to stand trial for what he did. They decided to combine the trials despite the many objections by Rodney's defense attorney. The trials began for the murders of the additional 4 victims, and you guys are going to like this, I sure did. They brought in a surprise witness. It was Tali Shapiro, the 8-year-old girl that had barely survived her encounter with Rodney Alcala 40 years earlier. Tali took the stand and told her story. She said that she and her family had been displaced when their house burned down and they were living in a hotel on Sunset Boulevard in 1968. Rodney Alcala approached the girl playing and told her he was a friend of her parents and that he wanted to show her a pretty picture. That is so evil. That is so evil. Tali remembers walking up the steps to Rodney Alcala's apartment, and then her memory goes blank. Then, like I said, one of Rodney's neighbors saw him taking a girl into his apartment, and this neighbor obviously had a feeling about Rodney. This is the person who called the police and saved Tali's life. After Tali testified, Rodney apologized to her for what he called his despicable behavior. Afterwards, Tali said, "He's never apologized before, and for him to even bother, it made me sick to my stomach." I'm really proud of her for testifying against him. I'm sure that took a lot, more than a lot of us have, and I hope she got some satisfaction from that. I really do. Finally, after so many years and several decades, it was going to be over. In March of 2010, Rodney Alcala was sentenced to death for the 3rd and final time.
He's got no soul or feelings.
Deputy District Attorney Matt Murphy delivered closing arguments Monday morning in the death penalty trial of Rodney Alcala, accused of killing 4 Los Angeles women between 1970 and 1979, and a 12-year-old girl from Huntington Beach in 1979.
These are first-degree murders. When you're talking about a guy like that, who is hunting through Southern California, looking for people to kill because he enjoys it,
Murphy told jurors they'd never see cases with more brutality.
he gets off on the infliction of pain on other people.
During the 6 weeks of evidence, Alcala, who is defending himself against the 5 murder charges, did not contest the accusations that he murdered the 4 women in Los Angeles County, but has been adamant that he is not responsible for the June 20th, 1979 abduction of 12-year-old Robin Samso. But Murphy told jurors Alcala lied about his alibi that he was at Knott's Berry Farm.
There isn't a single witness that puts Rodney Alcala at Knott's after 3 o'clock except for Rodney Alcala.
And Murphy insisted gold earrings belonging to Samso were recovered from a storage locker rented to Alcala in Seattle.
He expressed relief to his sister that the police didn't know about the storage locker. So what does an innocent man have to hide, number one?
And he questioned why Alcala changed the interior of his car shortly after Samso's disappearance.
He put new carpeting in his car. Who does that? Now, he said he spilled gas in there. Okay. Who does that?
Alcala has twice been tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for murdering Samso, but both cases were reversed on appeal. Before he could be tried a 3rd time, he was allegedly linked by DNA evidence to the 4 LA County slayings. DNA testing did not exist when the murders occurred.
Okay, 1 in 5.4 million. As a prosecutor with a DNA hit, I'll take that any day of the week. But in this case, we've also got a palm print.
Alcala will have a chance to deliver his own closing arguments this afternoon.
The portfolio of photographs was released around the time of the trial in 2010. I guess police figured enough time had passed and now they really had Rodney. They wouldn't need to protect the photos as evidence any longer. Only 120 of the photographs were released. The other 900 could not be because they were too explicit. Only one of the photos has been tied to a missing person. In 2013, the family of Christine Thornton recognized her among Rodney's pictures. Christine went missing in Wyoming in 1977. Her body wasn't discovered until 1982. She was badly decomposed and she was not identified until 2015, so her family suffered a very long time not knowing what happened to her. Rodney later admitted to taking the photo of Christine, but he denied killing her and he never stood trial for her death. Rodney Alcala has since been linked to more crimes. The murders of Cornelia Criley, a flight attendant, of course Ellen Hover, the Ciro's heiress. Both of those murders took place in New York. He has been named a person of interest in the unsolved murder of Antoinette Whitaker, 13, murdered in July of 1977, and in the murder of Joyce Gaunt, 17, murdered in February of 1978. Both of those cases occurred in Seattle. Investigators in San Francisco say they are confident that Alcala killed 19-year-old Pamela Jean Lamson, who disappeared from Fisherman's Wharf in 1977 as well. He's also being looked into for cases in New Hampshire and Arizona. So we're going to have to follow up on this. We're going to have to wait and see if the DNA shows us that he's guilty of more crimes. Rodney Alcala sat rotting in jail for decades. By the time he was dragged out of his cage for his 2010 trial, he was this greasy-looking, very creepy old man. He looked almost female, like an old witch or something. He kept his long, curly hair, but he now looked more like a hag than a 70s hippie. His health began to deteriorate, his long locks were chopped off, and he began spending a lot of time in the care of the prison medical personnel. On July 24, 2021, he was taken to a hospital near the Corcoran State Prison in California, where he had spent many years, and he died of natural causes. One of the prosecutors on his case said, "He was the cruelest and most sadistic murderer I ever prosecuted in 17 years." Steve Mack, a Huntington Beach police detective who headed the case during one of the appeals, said, "Father Time finally did what the courts wouldn't. Let's see him appeal this." I love that. I love that. One of the greatest monsters and most prolific serial killers of the 1970s was dead. Everyone from law enforcement to people who have studied this case agree. We will never know how many people he hurt, and we will never know how many people he killed, but I think we can all agree the world is a better place now that he's gone. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more. If you'd like to really support me, you can join my Patreon. It helps immensely. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.